Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is the not so long awaited open world Ubisoft title set in the magical world of Pandora from James Cameron's Avatar movies. The game, developed by Massive Entertainment, who are more famously known for The Division and the upcoming Star Wars Outlaws, without question manages to deliver a game that is a feast for the senses. Nailing many aspects of its world design, and visually speaking, it's one of the most impressive games I have ever played, and I many times just stopped and slowly panned across the screen to take in the incredible visuals in all their glory. But if you're familiar with Ubisoft open world games, this wouldn't exactly be foreign to you. Quite often Ubisoft games are visually stunning open worlds with not a lot of meat on the bone. Whether that be filler content forcing you to explore to unlock underwhelming rewards, or a lackluster story that fails to hook you. This has been a massive problem for recent Ubisoft titles, with Assassin's Creed Valhalla and Far Cry 6 springing to mind immediately. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is definitely something similar. Although the game does a lot right, it succumbs to the typical Ubisoft drawbacks we've seen in many of their open world games of late. So today, we're going to dive in deep on Frontiers of Pandora's open world, the gameplay, the combat, the story, really analyze and break down and get to the bottom of why Frontiers of Pandora is simply the best and worst of Ubisoft. So let's talk about the open world of Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which simply is the main selling point of this game, because the idea of being able to explore James Cameron's incredibly complex alien world is one that's interesting on the base level, and this absolutely does translate into this game. Although Frontiers of Pandora is a game with many problems, all of which we will get into, one of the aspects of this game that Massive Entertainment have completely nailed is the audio and visual aspect of bringing Pandora to life. You can just aimlessly travel around Pandora by foot, horseback, or even fly through dense jungles, open plains, floating mountains, decayed forests. The variety that Pandora offers in terms of its landscape leads to one of the game's biggest strengths. And that is simply just spending time in an incredibly immersive alien world. Now, this isn't exactly a newfound strength when it comes to Ubisoft open worlds, whether it's ancient Egypt, mysterious islands, Victorian London. Ubisoft open worlds at worst tend to be a pretty fun sandbox experience. The problem is, once that novelty wears off, the game's flaws rear their ugly head, and that makes these games hard to finish. Like, I remember climbing the pyramids in Assassin's Creed Origins, and after that I was kind of over the novelty of the location, and then the tedious side of the typical Ubisoft open world game design overshadowed the rest of the game. Frontiers of Pandora was very similar in this aspect, but on a lesser scale. So, in the first few hours of the game, the world itself completely saved me from potentially ending my playtime then and there, as those first few hours of the game require you to simply walk everywhere you go. Maybe you get 1 or 2 fast travel points, but you're essentially forced to traverse the map by foot, and this is a damn big map. Now, the novelty of exploring Pandora was enough to keep me interested, but it must be said that this game would simply be tedious as hell if you couldn't traverse the map in the various ways that you unlock as you progress through the game. Once you unlock flying, this is a complete game changer for exploring this world, and it gives the game a strong second wind. Bonding with your Ikran was something I was always looking forward to. It's one of the more iconic moments in the movies, and to be able to do it yourself is definitely a fan pleaser. But being able to traverse Pandora by air is simply one of the game's greatest strengths, at least for a while, but we'll get to that later. But being able to fly above the clouds is something that really helps highlight the scale of this open world. Or even flying onto a floating mountain and jumping off and letting your Ikran catch you. It's moments like this where this game flourishes. Just being able to bask in the beauty of Pandora, I'd argue, is worth the price of this game alone. All I will say is, though, if you have the capability, play this game on the highest settings possible, because this is simply one of the most breathtaking games in a visual sense that I can perhaps remember. I seriously don't know how this game ran as well as it did, because the foliage density in these jungles is just next level. I've never seen a game like it. Now, I was running this game at 4K, completely maxed out ultra settings, and my FPS basically never dropped below 60. Yes, I do have a pretty beefy PC, but I really gave this game a good testing, and it held up very well. It's fair to say that in terms of the visual aspect of this game, it signifies the best of what you typically see in open world Ubisoft titles. But in terms of the open world, that's kind of where the praise stops for me. Because here is where the Ubisoftification side of things comes into play, because this game is not short on filler or tedious content spread throughout the map to force you to explore. We see this across many Ubisoft titles, and it's become a bit of a meme at this point. We even addressed it in our last video on Marvel's Spider-Man 2. It's kind of this disease that is spread throughout many modern open world games. Frontiers of Pandora is definitely not immune from this issue. This game never really did a whole lot different in terms of the type of content spread around the map to encourage you to explore. Like, if you have played Far Cry games, you have played Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. There isn't really anything new here. Liberating outposts have sort of become a staple of modern Ubisoft titles, especially since Far Cry 3 onward, and you're once again forced to do that here. You know, you traverse the map, you see an outpost, you clear the outpost quietly so enemies can't call in reinforcements, and Bob's your uncle, outpost liberated, and there's still another 20 to go. It's pretty much the same deal here. Now, they did try and tie it into the world here by having the forest around it virtually dead, and when you liberate the outpost, it all comes back to life again, meaning that you can now find fruit and animals in that area once again. But in reality, this was still as Ubisoft as it gets. It also must be said that you can randomly stumble across these outposts, and you can be drastically underleveled, which means you get absolutely destroyed. I had this happen a few times, and it forced me to keep an eye on the map as I was traveling, often breaking any immersion I was feeling at the time. Now, it must be said there is a mode that you can switch in the settings which makes things really immersive, called Exploration Mode, which takes waypoints away and forces you to figure out where you need to be based on information that you're given in a cutscene. I tried this out for a little while, and it was indeed an excellent addition to the game, and I recommend everyone tries it out. Now, there are plants and items spread around the world that help you to develop new skills, collect loot, and weapon upgrades. Now, some of these I actually felt were worth doing and looking for. Like, learning ancient skills is something that I felt like I actually wanted to do here, but quite often I would fly past one of the many purple or green highlights on the map, and after sinking 20 odd hours into the game, I no longer felt the need to collect everything I found. I'd just ignore them. And me personally, I like to be a bit of a completionist, but I just didn't feel the need to, as a lot of the content spread around this map was very formulaic and a little boring and not really worthwhile. So if you're watching this video and you're a bit of a completionist, you are going to have a really tough time here. So obviously this open world here is absolutely huge, and it's made up of 3 major areas: the Kinglor Forest, the Clouded Forest, and the Upper Plains. I really found myself getting a little bored of the Upper Plains. It's just a lot of open fields and random mountains. But the Clouded Forest and Kinglor Forest were joys to explore, especially Kinglor Forest, as this is where most of the visuals become recognizable from the movies. And at night, this place is simply incredible. Like, you will just stand in the middle of the jungle and just take it all in, and it's glorious. That's where this game shines. Whether you're below or above the forest canopy, it's a feast for the eyes, it's a feast for the ears. Now, it is worth noting that a lot of this game is spent flying on your Ikran, and this thing flies so damn slow. So toward the end of my playtime, I was doing a lot of fast traveling, which is something that I default to quite quickly in Ubisoft open world games. Frontiers of Pandora was just a bit of a fast travel simulator for me by the end of my playtime, again, once the novelty of the world wore off. And that's what I think is the main issue with this game's open world. The novelty does wear off, and then you're left with an overwhelming world with a lot of senseless activities that have been copied and pasted from Ubisoft titles you've already played. Don't get me wrong, some of the content spread throughout the world is worth doing and worth seeing, but how many times before it becomes a little bit stale? So the gameplay side of Frontiers of Pandora is a bit of a mixed bag. There is a lot to love here, but there are a few things that I found to be either lacking or just maybe a little heavy-handed. The general movement of this game was way better than I thought it was going to be, really embracing the first-person view. You can jump, you can slide, you can traverse treetops, and there is a strong emphasis on the environment around you dictating how you traverse the map. And when you get used to the game's movement, it's incredibly satisfying and enjoyable to navigate the forest canopy. You can walk over plants that increase your speed that makes it feel even better. I distinctly remember a moment in my playthrough where I was on a cliffside and I saw large leaves hanging off trees. And I remembered a scene from the movies where they used the leaves to break their fall. So with no regard for my own life, I jumped off the cliff, and to my surprise, this is a mechanic of the game that you can use. It felt like a really nice little reward for having seen the movies. So needless to say, the movement side of the gameplay was a pleasant surprise that I was just not expecting. Now, the combat side of the gameplay, I also found it to be surprisingly in-depth. It does feel very familiar to games like Far Cry in the sense that gunplay feels pretty much exactly the same. And there is a forced emphasis on stealth, which can quickly evolve into chaos and reinforcements being called in. It's exactly like Far Cry. But in terms of weapons, you only really have the option of a shotgun, an assault rifle, and occasionally a rocket launcher. So you can use RDA guns like the Na'vi do in the movies, but you of course have your own native weapons such as the spear thrower, the sling, and 3 versions of the bow, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. There is only one grenade in this game though, apart from explosive arrows, that being the stun grenade, which you can use to stun mechs and yank the pilot out of them in a pretty cool animation. I think this game truly benefits a lot for it actually being fairly difficult. RDA outposts and POIs tend to be full of mechs, which can be a real pain in the ass to clear out. They have different versions of these mechs, including some that barrage you with rockets. Even if they have no direct line of sight of you, they just still know exactly where you are. It's actually kind of annoying. And there is, of course, foot soldiers, which look like ants compared to you, as you're obviously like 3 times the size of a human. But for some reason, the human soldiers in this game can drop you so fast. Like, I swear I died more from humans than mechs. And the mechs in numbers are an absolute nightmare. Though it must be said, there was a moment in the story where I was stuck behind a door with like 7 mechs just waiting to 2-shot me the second it opened. And I eventually did manage to cheese it, kill them all, and then teabag them to establish dominance. But then only to be met with another half a dozen which killed me almost instantly, so that was kind of karma. What I'm trying to say is, the game is difficult, and the combat, although satisfying, can be very frustrating. It's not as simple as Far Cry games where you equip a sniper, put the silencer on, and pick everyone off. You actually have to think about things a little bit more, which I actually appreciated overall. So it felt distinctively Ubisoft, but better. It felt like Far Cry, but better. Now, the loot system of this game, to be honest, is one of its biggest problems. At least that's how I felt throughout my playtime. Results may vary, of course, but this game is very heavy-handed when it comes to its loot. You end up throwing things away every 5 seconds and spending all this time in the menus trying to figure out which individual weapon is slightly better and then changing mods on each individual weapon. It's just tedious, and by the game's end, I just stopped caring about the loot overall. Like, you go through weapons and clothing like there is no tomorrow here because you're always picking something up. So I often found myself playing for like 20 minutes and then all of a sudden I had several items sitting there that I needed to equip to get that spicy +1 upgrade. I would have much rathered if they just gave us one of each individual weapon or item and let us upgrade it ourselves through playing the game, instead of picking up a slightly different version of the same thing and having you drop your old one every 5 seconds. This loot system feels very reminiscent of AC Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, and I don't think it did this game any favors at all. It ended up being just a bit of a mess of loot and items that you don't even know are worth holding anymore. And on that topic, Hunting, gathering, and cooking is also a major part of this game, as you would expect from an Avatar game. And I think most of what is here works pretty well. I like that there is an emphasis on a clean kill and putting pelts and items from these animals to good use. It fits in with the world very well. But I don't think the game really invested me quite enough to really go out of my way to hunt. There are some story missions which require you to hunt, and I enjoyed it whilst it was there, and I dabbled at random points throughout my playtime, but I don't think the hunting aspect of this game really hooked me the way the developers might have been hoping. I understand many people will enjoy this aspect of the game and will spend hours doing so, but it all came back to the loot system, as you get pelts from these animals to craft new items. So because I wasn't a fan of the loot system of this game, I didn't spend anywhere near as much time with the hunting as I initially thought I was going to. Same goes for the cooking. Now granted, this ties into the gameplay quite heavily, as having certain boosts from cooking specific meals can be useful whilst in combat or hunting, but going out of my way to spend an hour looking for a rare mushroom for a 5-minute stamina boost was just not really worth it. So meals that I came across throughout the game were more than enough for my playthrough. I never felt like cooking was a mechanic that I needed to participate in, so I never really did after the halfway point. Now, it also must be said that Avatar puts a really strong emphasis on hacking RDA tech. A lot of this game is you playing this little hacking minigame to access computers, doors, mech suits, you name it, you're probably going to end up hacking it in this game. So if you don't enjoy little mini games like this, then yeah, like good luck to you, my friend. Look, I'm normally fine with these kinds of mini games, and even these started to get on my nerves the further I got into the game, almost to the point where I wouldn't take out sky bases anymore because I was sick of having to hack everything in sight. I think they overused this mechanic as a key component of the gameplay, and the problem is many smaller activities in the world require you to do this over and over again. So it can make side content around the world, which is already kind of tedious in itself, feel even more tedious. And touching on gear, this has nothing to do with gameplay, but I have to talk about it. I don't know why, but Ubisoft felt the need to add a store to this game so you can spend 20 bucks on cosmetics that look like basically everything you can get in the game anyway. This was extremely disappointing to see, and I was really hoping stuff like this wasn't going to carry over from other Ubisoft titles like Assassin's Creed, but here we are. Anyway, back on topic. Overall, the gameplay of Frontiers of Pandora is a bit of a mixed bag. The movement side of the gameplay can be extremely satisfying and rewarding to pull off as you traverse the world, and the combat side of things for the most part is really enjoyable. There are some cool animations that are a lot of fun to pull off, and the emphasis on stealth due to the game being reasonably difficult, forcing you to think about engagements a little more, is something I certainly appreciate. But many aspects of this game's functionality falls apart for me when it comes to the loot system. I think it's a little messy, a little convoluted, with too much loot for the game's own good. And although the hunting and cooking is a fun element of the game, I never really felt the need to actively engage in it to make my experience better. Aerial gameplay is fun, albeit a little bit clunky in some areas, and sliding around nailing your bow shots is always fun. But the overall gameplay of Frontiers of Pandora, it's just, again, very Ubisoft.
I'm very disappointed in you.
So let's talk about the story of Frontiers of Pandora, as this, to be honest, I think is the weakest part of the game in true Ubisoft fashion. When I think of fun video games with bad stories, I think of Ubisoft games, and Frontiers of Pandora has given me no reason to change that. Now, I'm not going to talk major spoilers, as I understand a lot of you haven't played the game yet, so no stress if you don't want to be spoiled. I'm only going to address what I need to. So you play as one member of a group of Na'vi children that have been raised by the RDA. The game then ties into the events of the movie, with Jake Sully's uprising and the RDA packing up shop and leaving Pandora, and in the process they try to kill all of the children. You're taken aside by a human in an avatar body and put into cryosleep, where you wake up 10 years later. You find out that you're a member of the Sarentu clan, which is a clan that people thought went extinct, and then you set off on a journey discovering your Na'vi roots and attempt to rally other Na'vi clans together to fight the RDA that have returned to Pandora. It's a pretty simple story. There are elements of it that are extremely similar to that of the movies in the sense that you need to rally clans together to fight the RDA. The difference here though is that you're just a kid and you've been thrown into this massive rebellion with a motive of carrying on your clan's legacy. Unfortunately, despite being a relatively strong setup for a good story, I found the story of this game severely lacking. In true Ubisoft fashion, the writers failed to provide a story that was easy to really sink your teeth into. I often found myself progressing through the story more so for progression purposes and unlocking new areas as opposed to actually finding out what happens next. There are some notable moments in the story, such as finding out more about the Sarentu clan and what led them to now, and how the children came into contact with the RDA in the first place. But a lot of the story just doesn't work because the game's villains are as generic and underutilized as you could possibly imagine. John Mercer is the game's main villain, and his character is as generic as his name. His motivations are pretty unclear and he lacks any real presence throughout the game, as he is only really in the game at the beginning and the end. And considering that the story does give you plenty of reasons to hate him and want him dead, I still didn't really feel like he was an effective antagonist. Like, I think back to some great Far Cry villains of the past, as Ubisoft tends to do pretty well when it comes to its villains, and I think back to Vaas from Far Cry 3 and Pagan Min from Far Cry 4, and I remember how incredible they were. Even when they were absent from the spotlight, you still felt their presence. And when you actually got to see them, you couldn't look away. And I think about John Mercer in this game and I just feel nothing. Despite the fact the game starts in very similar fashion to Far Cry 3, with the villain being a bit of a prick. If you've played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yet despite that, I still had no desire for revenge as the player. The character was just bland, generic, and seriously forgettable. There was actually a time halfway through the story where I actually forgot he was in the game, which I think says it all really. There's also his underling, Colonel Harding. She was also just as forgettable. I couldn't tell you a thing about the character other than she was generic, angry military woman. That's pretty much it. But steering away from the villains, there were some moments where you rally the clans together that I found to be pretty enjoyable. Seeing how other clans operate, their culture, and how they live their life. You know, that was interesting, and the story takes you to a few different clans to rally their cause, and I kind of enjoyed that. But ultimately, I found the game's story to be a little bland and, to be honest, kind of boring. I often found myself wanting to skip major cutscenes, not because I have the attention span of a fork, but because I just didn't really care enough about where the story was going or the characters in it. I think they played with some interesting ideas, such as a native being raised in captivity and then being thrust back out into the world and having to learn and discover themselves. But I think the writing just wasn't as strong as some of the story and character concepts were. Like, there's a really damn good story in there somewhere, but the quality of writing just doesn't bring it out. The ending, it must be said, was also extremely generic, and when the story came to an end, I was kind of happy that it was out of the way so I can just endlessly explore every square inch of Pandora with no limitations. I understand that some people may enjoy the story, but to be honest, I think this is the weakest element of what is otherwise a pretty decent game. So to bring this one all together, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is Far Cry in space. It showcases the best and worst of what you come to expect from Ubisoft open world games. Massive Entertainment did an excellent job bringing Pandora to life. The attention to detail of the world itself is honestly breathtaking. And I wouldn't be exaggerating to say it's one of the most immersive and visually impressive open world games available today. It's easily the best on the Ubisoft roster, that's for sure. And although the game has relatively strong combat and it can be really enjoyable to explore, the game does have a flawed looting system that spreads its issues into many of the game's better ideas, such as hunting, crafting, and cooking. And the story is as generic as you really come to expect from Ubisoft games. Overall, I think Frontiers of Pandora is a good game. It's got a lot of problems, but it does enough right to be considered worthwhile and be considered a good game. And that's mainly thanks to its incredible world. If you love Far Cry and you love Avatar, this game is a match made in heaven. But ultimately, at its core, this game showcases the best and the worst of Ubisoft.